Hey everybody, so in this lecture we're going to be talking about energy, matter, and trophic levels. So remember, trophic levels are just the feeding level of different organisms in a food web or a food chain. So for example, here you can see the different trophic level 1 where you've got plants collecting energy from the sun. Those plants are being eaten. In trophic level 2 by this grasshopper. This grasshopper in turn is being eaten by this little mole shrew looking thing, this little rodent looking thing that gets eaten by the next trophic level, which is the owl. And then all of these things also die and produce waste and feces and things like that. And those can all get eaten by worms and mushrooms and fungi or, vultures that eat dead animals, okay? And so what I'd like you to do is just looking at this food web, label each level that we're looking at here, the organisms in each level, as either a primary producer, a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, a tertiary consumer. Where appropriate, label all the herbivores, label all the carnivores, label all the detritivores, and then label each as either autotrophic or heterotrophic. So you should have came up with something that looks like this, where the plants are autotrophic and they're what's called primary producers. So they're bringing energy in from the sunlight and they're converting that sunlight into chemical energy that's biologically available for all of these other organisms. Okay, so they take the electromagnetic radiation, turn it into chemical energy in the bonds of sugars through photosynthesis, and then that in turn that energy is available to these grasshoppers. These are heterotrophs. They are a primary consumer or an herbivore. That's sort of interchangeable terms. Those primary consumers of grasshoppers are in turn eaten by the secondary consumer, this sort of shrew rodent thing, and that is a carnivore. Carni means meat, so it's eating meat. And then you've got this tertiary consumer, the owl, at the fourth trophic level. This is also a heterotroph. It's also a carnivore, remember. Carne is it means meat, and vor means eater, whereas herbi means eating herbs. And then you've got the detritivores down here. So detritus basically just means like dead stuff and wastes. And this is also a heterotroph. So worms, bacteria, fungi, scavengers like vultures, they're all examples of detritivores that eat wastes and dead things, and they consume those things, okay? And a couple key observations to draw from this is number one, only the autotrophs, only the plants, only the primary producers are bringing new biologically available energy into the system. So the sun puts out the energy, but it's only the primary producers that are able to turn that energy into a biologically useful form. And then that gives access for all of these other sort of levels of consumers to that energy. So only the autotrophs are bringing energy into the system. All the rest are depending on the energy that the autotrophs bring into that system. And the other important thing is that only autotrophs are fixing carbon from the air. So remember, all organisms are carbon-based. They all need access to carbon. They all build all their basic biological molecules out of carbon. And the only source of carbon for these organisms, the only biologically available source of carbon for these organisms, is mostly coming from these primary producers that are able to do photosynthesis and take carbon dioxide, which is a non-biological form, and turning it into a biological form. So there are bacteria that are able to do that as well, that are autotrophic organisms. But all of these other groups, other than the bacteria, have to get their carbon from a biologically available source, and they have to get it from these primary producers that can do photosynthesis. Okay, so let's look at what happens to the energy and matter as it transfers from each of these different trophic levels. So from the primary producers and on up through the food chain, okay? So if we have a primary producer, a plant, we can think of it as this great plant as an example. You've got sunlight that's got electromagnetic energy. Photosynthesis happens. It converts that electromagnetic energy into chemical bonds in biologically available molecules, chemical bonds in the sugars and the glucose that's produced in photosynthesis. It's also assimilating CO2 from the atmosphere and turning that into biologically useful forms, okay? And of that total assimilation of energy and carbon, about 2/3 of it disappear or dissipate out into the environment. So they leave the food chain in the sense that this plant, it does photosynthesis, but it also does cellular respiration. So plant cells also have mitochondria. They're doing cellular respiration. That process of cellular respiration, they're producing CO2. They're producing heat as an output. And all of that stuff is essentially leaving the system. So it's going out of the plant, and it's therefore not available to the next trophic level. It's basically part of the metabolism that plant uses. And only about 1/3 of that total energy and carbon and other nutrients are actually assimilated into the biomass of the plant, okay? And so only that 1/3 that's basically used for growth and reproduction is energy and biomass that's available for the next trophic level, okay? So you've got a big loss of energy and matter from this individual organism and only a little bit left over for the next trophic level. And so let's look at the next trophic level of this grasshopper that's eating one of those grape leaves, okay? So this is a primary consumer. Typically, and these numbers are going to vary from system to system and organism to organism, but typically you get a structure or something similar to this where about 50% of the heat and the carbon and other nutrients and the energy are lost as feces. So this goes out to the detritivores. 33% of the energy that this organism, this grasshopper, this herbivore is getting from that plant, 33% of that is lost to cellular respiration. So once again, energy is lost as heat through cellular respiration, and you're losing carbon as well as other potential molecules as CO2 going out into the system, okay? And only 17% of that energy that it gets from this plant is actually invested in growth, in growing actual grasshopper. And only 17% of that is energy and biomass that's available, therefore, for the next trophic level. All the rest gets dissipated, and this is either going to those detritivores down at the bottom of the food chain, or it's disappearing out into the environment and no longer biologically available. And this continues on up the food chain, okay? And so if we look at the basic way that energy flows and matter cycles through a community or through a food chain or through a food web, we can use this very simplified food chain. So let's just look at the left side of this right here and look at how energy flows through a food chain, okay? So the primary producers turn that sunlight into biologically useful chemical bonds. So it's takes that energy and turns the electromagnetic energy into chemical energy that's available to all these different levels. And as that energy moves up from one trophic level to the next, a lot of it is dissipated out as heat. And that heat actually leaves planet Earth. So it'll dissipate out into the environment, from the environment out into outer space. And so that energy that came from the sun initially and space initially goes back out to space. It leaves Earth. Now, matter, on the other hand, so nutrients, so when we think of nutrients, we're talking about things like ultimately carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of those elements that are used to make up the macromolecules that are biologically necessary molecules for organisms to exist. And so when we talk about those nutrients, we're talking about matter. And matter, importantly, it cycles. So if you've got this primary producer that produces some amount of biomass, that biomass, some percentage of it ends up dying or getting wasted and goes down to the decomposers. So these are the detritivores. So these are things that are taking in things like CO2, feces, wastes, all the sort of dead detritus that gets left around. It cycles down. So everything dies and creates waste, and it gets recycled and actually goes and cycles over and over through the system. Okay, so at each point, a little bit gets passed on to each next level, and a little bit ends up getting passed off to these decomposers, which ultimately end up turning all that stuff into soil, or it ends up going to the atmosphere and ends up getting cycled back into these primary producers, okay? But the key thing here is that these atoms, this matter, these elements, they never leave Earth. So unless, Elon Musk turns them into a spaceship and shoots it out into space, never to return, for the most part, all of that carbon, all of those other elements, all the matter is just going to be recycled over and over and over again. So carbon and other elements, aka matter, are recycled. by these decomposers. And so the key punchlines here is that matter and nutrients cycle and recycle through food chains, whereas energy flows and eventually exits planet Earth. So it comes from outside Earth, flows through a system, and leaves Earth. And when you add all this up, it turns out that on average, and once again, this is going to vary hugely and widely from system to system, but on average, only about 10% of the energy and matter is transferred from one trophic level to the next. So for example, if you think of initially, you've got 100% of the energy in the system in these primary producers, so these are the plants. About 10% of that makes it up to the herbivores, and then about 10% of that makes it up to these secondary consumers, and then about 10% of that makes it up to these top level predators like the owl that we saw in that first figure. And so only about 0.1% of the energy that was initially available in the system is actually available for those top level consumers, okay? And so this is something called an ecological pyramid. And this goes to show that the transfer of energy and biomass is very inefficient from one trophic level to another. Okay, and so this is often results in what we typically see in communities, these food pyramids and this idea of ecological efficiency. And it's actually probably a misnomer. It's better to call it ecological inefficiency because so much energy and matter is lost from one trophic level to the next. So for example, if you look at this marine system here where you've got the primary producers at the bottom, which are photosynthetic, what's called plankton. So these are sort of marine plants. And then you've got herbivores in that system, and then you've got first level carnivores in the system. And this is basically just a measure of the amount of energy that's produced at each of these levels per square meter per year within a sort of productive area in the ocean. And what you can see is these photosynthetic plankton produce a way, way, way more energy per square meter per year than the herbivores or first level carnivores do. And if you look at the actual biomass of each of these different groups per square meter, so if you just measure the total weight of plankton per square meter versus herbivores per square meter versus first level carnivores per square meter, what you can see is there's way more of those primary producers than the herbivores and first level carnivores in terms of biomass if you average it out across sampling a sort of larger area. And if you look at it by the numbers, so if you just to count the number of photosynthetic plankton versus herbivores versus carnivores in that same area, you'd see that there's way, way, way more individuals within the population. So obviously these are smaller individuals because this translates to these different weights. But the point here is you're able to support way more individuals typically of the primary producers than usually way fewer of the herbivores and even fewer of the carnivores and on up the food chain, okay? And so this idea of food pyramids and ecological efficiency, or better named inefficiency, is basically when we look at different trophic levels from primary producers all the way up to secondary carnivores. So these sort of sideways bars here represent the typical sort of population size that we'll see as we move up a food chain. And typically you'll see a 10-fold reduction or greater in population size as you move up trophic levels. Typically, top-level predators are few in number and have really large ranges. So in other words, you know, this top-level carnivore, this big raptor, an eagle, or whatever it is, typically there's way fewer of them per a sort of unit area in a geographical area, geographical map, and typically they have to cover a ton of ground to be able to get enough food to support them. So in other words, to find enough foxes to be able to support this one individual, at least in this example. And rarely do you get more than 3 or 4 trophic levels unless you're in some of the most high energy systems, okay? So typically there's not enough energy to support more than 3 or 4 trophic levels. So typically you only get a second carnivore, maybe one more than that, but that's really pushing it in terms of the amount of energy available to that next trophic level. And this is one of the arguments that's been used for being vegetarian. So basically the idea, or one of the arguments that's made, and this is true more or less, and it's going to vary depending on sort of where you look, but in general, for about 1 pound of hamburger, you need about 6 to 7 pounds of grains and forage, not to mention a ton of water and a ton of other resources just to produce that 1 pound of hamburger. Now, obviously, or maybe not obviously, it's way more nuanced than that because, you know, how much how much grass do you need to eat to be able to get the same amount of sort of feeling full and nutrients that you get from a pound of hamburger. But the basic argument here is that if you want to just use less resources in general, it's way more bang for your buck to be vegetarian, because you can get way more plants with way less of an energy investment than you would need for the same investment to get a pound of hamburger. Okay, which of the following is true? All right, hopefully you said matter is recycled, but not energy. So remember, matter cycles through systems over and over again, whereas heat energy comes in from outer space. It's dissipated as heat as it moves through a food chain and is ultimately lost out into the environment again and moves off of Earth out into space again. So energy flows, matter cycles. The organisms at the top of a food web overall have less available energy than the trophic levels below them. Okay, so here's the tertiary consumers, and they have about 1% of the energy that's initially available at the bottom of the food chain, and that's because energy is lost, typically somewhere around 10%, give or take, as you move up the food chain. The biomass in a food web primarily comes from the primary producers, okay? So once again, if you look at a typical pyramid of biomass, most of the biomass in any food web or food chain, however you want to call it, however you want to look at it, is going to be in the primary producers.